really popular one is, what are Israelis supposed to do because of the rockets?
Well, let's start with the cause and then we'll get to the effect. The question is whether the rockets are the cause or are they the effect? And I'm going to do everything in my power to be absolutely respectful of the questions and to assume that the questions are being asked in good faith. So I would ask the person, what would you do if you were trapped in this sliver of land, which respectable human rights organizations call an open air prison, which respectable scholars describe as a concentration camp? What would you do? And in particular, what would you do if you had a large number of children? Gaza families tend to be on the larger side. If you had a large number of children and they were trapped like you, and you knew each day when you gave them water that you were poisoning them, the water is unfit for human consumption. And what would you do if this didn't go on for 1 month, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, but the worst condition? Everything is relative because Baruch Kimmerling was talking about 2003 and he described it as a concentration camp. Let's start from when the blockade, the intensity of the blockade was escalated in 2006 and then 2007. So we're talking about now, we're talking about 15 years. What would you do? Would you lay down and die? Would you passively accept your fate? What would you do? The Palestinians don't have, in Gaza, don't have an infinite number of options if they want to retain their dignity. I assume, and actually in recent years, there have been minor, pretty minimal offers by Israel to Palestinians. We'll open the door if you promise never to come back. To a few Palestinians, that offer has been made. But if you are determined to stay in your home, what options really do you have? When Hamas was elected in 2006, in that fair and free election, Hamas had made many statements. I can't go through them all with you now, but they are documented. They made many statements indicating that they were willing to accept a settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict on the June 1967 border, what's called the two-state settlement. They did enter a concern about the settlement of the refugee question, and it's a real question, it's a complicated question, but they were perfectly reasonable in the terms that they were willing to negotiate on. Israel rejected all of them. Israel will only accept one thing from Palestinians. You have to, I'll give you an analogy. During the era of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, Ronald Reagan was the president. And he said at the time, we're waiting for the Sandinistas to cry uncle. Mm-hmm. We're going to turn the screws, turn the screws, turn the screws until they cry uncle. And it's similar with the Palestinians in Gaza. Israel demands their surrender. Israel demands that they accept a fate that is less equal than that of Jews. Now, to your listener, to your viewer, to your questioner, you may think that what I'm saying is an exaggeration. You might say it's being emotive, rhetorical, and so forth. It's not my opinion. See, this is the thing. If you read the human rights organization B'Tselem, which is
The Israeli, just so everyone knows, the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem.
Yes, and its leader, Haggai Elad, he has an op-ed in today's Washington Post. And he says in the Washington Post, in understated prose, but nonetheless in accurate prose, not trying to massage the truth, he says, and I'll quote not from his op-ed, but from the position paper that B'Tselem issued. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. And then he goes on to say, describing the whole of Israel, not just the Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the whole area from the river to the sea. He says it is organized under a single principle. There's one principle that underlies that whole area, advancing and cementing the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians. That is what they want the Palestinians to accept. Not just in Gaza, everywhere from the river to the sea. They want Palestinians to accept a Jewish supremacist state. Human Rights Watch uses a different locution. It doesn't say a Jewish supremacist state. It says it's a state based on Jewish domination. Now, I ask your questioner, is any people obliged, are they obliged to accept a system where the dominant group insists across the board in distribution of tax money, in distribution of land, in access to towns, in access to building permits? In East Jerusalem, that's the big issue, the building permits. They won't give an Arab a building permit. Why? It's very simple. I would like your listener to hear it. Because they want a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. They want a Jewish majority in Israel. They want a Jewish majority everywhere. And then I have to ask your questioner, are they obliged to accept that fate? Would you ever, assuming your questioner is an American, would you ever expect of an African American that he or she had to accept their fate, that they would be second-class citizens in the United States, that they would legally not have the right to a building permit because they're Black, legally not have equal schools, quality schools, because the budgets are distributed to prefer Jews, or in our case, it would be whites? Would you accept that fate? And then in Gaza, it's 10 more layers. It's not just Jewish supremacy. It's not just Jewish domination. It's being confined to an open air prison, a concentration camp, not being allowed to leave, not being allowed to come back. Now, I want to make one more point. I am not trying to be manipulative emotionally, though I think it's legitimate to be passionate about things. I'm trying to be factual. I would like people to understand what it means to be a person in Gaza. Gaza is 70% refugees. That means they already lost their homes. They already lost their homes. Then, once they were expelled to what became Gaza from the state, what became the state of Israel, then they were locked in the prison. They were locked in the prison. You don't want to hear the word concentration camp or the phrase concentration camp? Okay, I'll spare you. Although Baruch Kimmerling did not spare his readers, I'll spare you. They didn't want to be locked in the prison. They didn't want to be locked in the prison in among the most densely populated places in the world. So they went from expulsion to confinement. And then every few years, including as we speak right now, in the prison, their home is destroyed again. Expelled, imprisoned, and then Israel targets their home again. I've written quite extensively on this subject. These civilian homes that are destroyed during Operation Protective Edge in 2014 was 51 days. During Operation Protective Edge during July, August 2014, Israel destroyed 18,000 homes. Now, you might say fog of war. We like to use the word collateral damage, the phrase. That's not what happened. We have extensive testimony from Israeli soldiers. There was an organization then, I think it's since been inactive as far as I could tell. There was an organization called Breaking the Silence. Mm-hmm. And it was Israeli soldiers who described after Operation Protective Edge, what did they do? And if you read the descriptions, they would come into neighborhoods, rope off the neighborhoods. There's no fighting going on. There's no fog of war. They would rope off the neighborhoods, bring in D9 bulldozers, and just flatten the neighborhoods. I mean, the level of heartlessness, the level of callousness, the level of sheer moral debasement that the Israelis have undergone, it's kind of breathtaking. There's no human feeling. I remember I lived in the West Bank during the first Intifada. I lived with two families, one outside Fawar camp, which is a refugee camp, and one in Beit Sahur. And the family I lived with outside Fawar camp, it was a family name. The family name was Hesh, Hash. And the father, Musa Abu Hesh, he was a kind of a remarkable human being. At least I would say as remarkable human being as I've ever met in my life. And um, he eventually ended up working for B'Tselem. He's been there now for like the last 15 years. If you Google his name, I'm sure pictures will come up. He's quite well known among the people. And he once said to me, he was a communist and he has a kind of very cosmopolitan worldview. That's why when I went over with a delegation, and he insisted he wanted a Jew in his home. That was the kind of person he was and is. And I'll never forget, Israel at that time used to blow up homes of anybody who was accused of throwing rocks. That was their punishment, blow up the home. It's one thing to just talk about. It's another thing to see it. You go into a home, you tell the people to get out, you rope off the area, and you just blow it up. You blow up the house. And I remember he looked at me with, it was a kind of moral perplexity. How could people do that? For a Palestinian, the most precious thing they have, because they don't have investments, aside from the very rich class. I'm talking about ordinary Palestinian. There are no investments. There are no 401ks or things like that. All of their investment is their home.
Mm.
And to just routinely blow it up as if, I don't know, it's as if you're a kid in a block corner and someone next to you with a little maliciousness, you knock down their blocks. That's the kind of moral callousness. Callousness doesn't really catch it. It's really more moral debasement. So they lose their country. They're then confined in the prison. And then periodically, as we're speaking now for the fourth time, there was Operation Cast Lead, then Pillar of Defense, then Protective Edge, and it had been silent for about 7 years. And now it's Operation Guardian of the Wall, some ridiculous title. And now they're destroying the homes again. I don't think that anybody who has any knowledge of the topic would ask questions like, why are they firing rockets? The obvious question is, why aren't they firing more?
I agree. Yeah, of course. Yeah. But I think people, when they ask that question, they mean, what is Israel supposed to do? So,
well, I think the answer to that question is very straightforward. The answer is Israel should stop committing crimes against humanity and then see how the population conducts itself.